Well, Fanatic Friday here on Big 12 today on Big 12 Radio. Alongside Ari Timken, I'm James Westling. Our guest this hour has been Portnoy, college sports reporter for Sports Business Journal. Hey, Ben, good morning.
What's going on, guys? Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, man. When I see your stuff pop up on social media, I get excited because I know you're all over it. So give us just your initial thoughts on the Big 12 private capital deal is what we'll call it. So break it down for us, and what do you think this looks like for the league?
Yeah, so I think you make a good point off the bat is this is a private capital deal versus more of a private equity deal, which I think is it's nuanced and convoluted, but I think there's an important piece there is that, Redbird Capital is basically giving schools in the Big 12 and the conference office an opportunity to take some upfront cash to accelerate sort of growth areas that they see. So like think of places that they can generate more revenue essentially. Uh, this is not, say, for example, like the Big Ten deal that floated around in the earlier part of this year and last year. That was more a direct sort of ownership stake in the league and a new entity. This is a little bit different. Uh, what this is basically I like to look at it as kind of like a fund essentially, where Big 12 schools can say, hey, we'll sign up for this or we won't sign up for this. Uh, and we can use this money to, make up an example. Say you need whatever, $10 million dollars to help build out some suites that you think will help you, generate an extra $10 million dollars a year. And it's easier to get at this cash now than to go through the procurement process or things like that you would go through at the university level. Uh, that's kind of the idea here is that it's sort of like do with it what you will in order to generate revenue faster and accelerate that growth. It's a little bit, but again, every school is going to make that decision and that determination. My understanding is that I think that you'll probably see, I think half of the league would be a big number that will take part in this. But I do think that, it gives schools an opportunity basically to help accelerate growth, and I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, and the Big 12 had already some business dealings with Redbird Capital, and I think big picture, there's probably a strategic alignment here from Redbird's involvement with Paramount Skydance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that, one thing that, I think, Brett Yormark has gotten a lot of credit for and deserves a lot of credit for is sort of the creative ways that he's been able to get in business with pretty much all of the major players in college sports from the TV rights side of things. So, for example, obviously the Big 12 has its deal with ESPN and Fox from a, TV side of things, but by working with Redbird, which also is a shareholder in Paramount or what will be Skydance and all of those things, right? This is sort of an indirect, sort of backwards way to also work with CBS as well. And so you look at with the way that the Big 12 is positioned. Look, the reality is in college sports these days, the big dollars that come into college sports and the reason that we've seen the growth that we've seen and we see the numbers that get floated around all over the place is because of TV rights deals. And the Big 12 has essentially positioned itself to be working with in some form or fashion ESPN, Fox, CBS, and a handful of others, and is basically in a spot where now when you go to market for a new deal in a couple of years, uh, every single one of those TV networks will have, for lack of a better term, kind of sampled the product or have an idea of what the product is. Uh, and I think that's important when you have those relationships and you have working relationships with those people on a day-to-day basis. And I think that that's part of the positioning here as well.
Yeah, definitely. Ben, what do you make of the Duke announcement as they team up with Amazon Prime? It'll be their first college sports relationship. And what impact could that have on the future of the media landscape?
I think there's two things that kind of jump to mind is one, I think if you're Duke, it's a super creative way to kind of build your own television packages, overstating it, but to create your own sort of take control of your content essentially, and be able to monetize it a little bit, which I think is really smart, right? They're going to have a couple of big time non-conference matchups. They've signed this deal with Amazon. It's going to be for, millions of dollars. That's going to help, the bottom line at Duke, right? Like that's all good and well. That's super smart. We saw sort of discussions about this when Notre Dame and USC were trying to do a variation of this. The Big 12 said no. That didn't wasn't kosher with them. But I think that that's the next question I have here is, okay, if Duke's allowed to do this in the ACC, who else in the ACC might push this envelope? So if you're Florida State, if you're Clemson, if you're whoever, right? Like I'm raising my hand and saying, "Hey, I want to take two of my football games and sell them to a streamer. Like, can I do that?" Is ESPN going to say yes? I don't know, probably not. But I think that that's a conversation that then has to be had. Is that you've sort of set this precedent where you've allowed Duke to take a couple of major basketball games, and look, big time basketball games are different than big time football games. I get it, like from a price perspective, viewership, all those things, but you've opened the door to allow Duke to do this, and ESPN, as the rights holder with the ACC, has allowed Duke to do this. Who else is going to be allowed to do this? Are there other leagues that are going to look at this, right? Like I said, Notre Dame and USC talked about this, and the Big Ten put sort of the kibosh on that. Are there teams in the SEC? Is Alabama going to turn around and say, "Hey, we want to sell this game or that game"? Could Georgia and Georgia Tech go and try and sell their game to, Apple TV or something like that, right? A non-conference game. I don't know. I think that that's what this door opens, and I think becomes a really, really interesting thing to watch. Again, it requires a lot of agreement among people, and Lord knows that in college sports, there's not a lot of that these days. And so I think that you look at that, it again, it requires a lot of cooperation between TV rights holders, between the leagues, between the schools, all of those things. And so I don't know that it creates a trend necessarily. Maybe this turns into a one-off thing, but I do think it's a really interesting nugget that could prove to end up turning into a lot more if other leagues and schools try to make similar sort of overtures.
Yeah, agreed. And to me, there's like two parts to this. There's the streaming part, and so the first question I have for you is, how active do you think an Amazon Prime or an Apple will be in the next round of rights? And then the second part of that is, do you think this will change how those rights are written to not, if they want, let's say ESPN or Fox or Apple want the sort of exclusive rights to a conference, that it'll be written that they have then the exclusive rights to a conference, because this obviously supersedes that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think, look, I'm certainly not a lawyer, despite maybe playing one on television by the week, it seems. But I do think that when it comes to the contract language, like that creates an interesting caveat of like, will there be carve outs or things like that? But I do think you're right in that how do the TV networks look at this long term, or how do the streamers get involved? I think that, look, streamers have wanted to get involved in college sports and college football in particular. You look at sort of the unraveling of the Pac-12. Part of that was around the deal that they were going to sign with Apple, or that George Kliavkoff, the commissioner at the time, had brought forward with Apple TV. Uh, that didn't sort of rise to the number that those schools thought they should be getting, and that's essentially why the Pac-12 fell apart. That said, I do think that, look, there's really two kind of growth areas in college sports right now, right? It's the game, right? The on-field product is getting better, or remains really entertaining. And then it's the TV rights. Like the TV rights continue to grow and are a pretty steady bet. And so if you're Amazon or Apple or whoever, like you want to get into a growth area, and the TV rights are certainly that. And so, will we see, say, make up a league, right? Go sign a deal with ESPN and then bring on Amazon as a streamer as well, like to broadcast some games too. Like I think that's actually a super feasible option, and I think there's a lot of people considering things along those lines these days in a different way than they were maybe 5 years ago.
Man, Amazon Prime, I used to think, hey, that's where we watch our movies. And now it's sports on top of that. Speaking of movies, you spent a bunch of time reporting on your cover story that was Learfield's sale to TPG. And you noted that the movie business was a parallel that you found. What did you uncover, and what did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It gets at a little bit of what I was just saying, right? Like I think there's sort of two areas that a lot of people circle as far as like companies that want, or businesses, or even private equity that wants to get into college sports. There's kind of two ways to do that, and two places that make sense to do that. One of them is with the game, right? The game itself, the on the field product, and then it's the TV rights, and like those are the two sort of pillars of what's growing right now. Learfield, which I think, it's sort of broad strokes, essentially sells corporate sponsorships and things like that to brands and companies for on behalf of basically, probably more than half, close to 60 or 70% of the Power Four, about 100, 150 schools across Division One. They exist in a funny orbit where they're sort of a middleman, right? Like they're operating in that they don't own the rights or excuse me, the assets like the billboards or the jersey patches or things like that that they're selling. But they're also not, invested in the TV networks, for example, or things like that. And so they operate in a little bit of an interesting in between. And, the parallel I made was kind of you look at the movie business and it's sort of this interplay between movie theaters and movie studios, right? Like movie studios benefit off the fact of good movies are coming to the studios, but they're not dictating what those movies are. Whereas the studios are building out
Mm.
building movies or creating movies. But the product in the theater, like if the floor is sticky and the and the popcorn machine's broken or something like that, right? Like the studios don't own that asset. So it's this funny interplay where it's sort of who owns what and how they have to be a little bit codependent. And I think that when you look at a player like Learfield, and there's others, Playfly is one, JMI Sports, there's a lot of other companies that operate in this business, but I think Learfield obviously has the scale that's different than a lot of those. That it creates an interesting dynamic of like, what does that look like long term? What does that business look like long term when you have a private equity firm investing in it and spending, almost $2 billion to purchase this company? How can they grow the business when the back end of when ultimately like the big part of the business that is propping up the company is sort of this in between that you don't control those assets. And I think there's a lot of ways it can continue to grow, and there's reasons that people are super optimistic. But I think it's an interesting thing to track on over the coming years.
Ben, going back to the Redbird thing for a moment, I'm curious for a couple of reasons. Number one, like you brought up this distinction earlier, and I think it's really important. Like we call this private equity. This is not equity. This is a cash play. So there's not an equity involvement here. So it is appropriate to change the verbiage there. What's the end goal here for Redbird? Private equity wants to buy businesses and then sell them at a higher percentage, which they're really good at doing. That's not the play here. What's the long-term play for Redbird in your opinion? And second, what is the Big 12 doing with this money?
That is a really good question. And I think it's going to vary school by school. If you're the league office, like, are there certain initiatives or things like that that you can invest in that this helps accelerate? I think that's where you'll see it. Like again, with the schools, I use the facility example, but I think things like to that end, if you need $5 million, $10 million, $15 million quickly, this is a way to do it. As far as Redbird's long-term hopes, like I think it's a mix. I mean, I think look, like private equity firms have been circling college sports for much of the last, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, given the growth and given that also at the same time it's kind of a distressed asset, right? Like there's a lot of chaos in college sports and there's a lot of
Great
change that's
point.
probably going to come. And so because of that, there's opportunity in chaos a little bit, right? And I think that that's where you look at firms like a Redbird or others that have circled it. If you're Redbird, you're now directly involved in college sports in a way that others are not. And I think that creates a groundswell for whatever comes next. Is that a whatever? Is that a super league? Is it different opportunities with schools? Is it different opportunities with leagues? Things like that. It at least gets you in the conversation and at the table to say, hey, we're working in college sports, we're doing some things. Here's kind of what we've done. Here's what we see from the landscape, and it gets you a little closer to be a little more involved in that area. And I think that's part of the play at least. And again, I'm sure there are other things long term that they're looking at, but that's I think at a base level kind of what they see.
Ben, you noted this morning that Marshall agreed to a deal with a local health company. They're going to have a jersey patch, and they are the 11th school nationally. Is this just going to be the norm, you think, going forward to a point where we should just assume everybody's going to have a jersey patch with a sponsor?
I think so. I mean, I think it's something that it comes up a lot with any school, right? Like these days, everyone needs more cash, essentially. And jersey patches, and when you talk to people in sort of like the sponsorship world, that's the asset or the thing that can be sold that people see as like the most valuable. Like that's more valuable than a field logo. It's more valuable than a ribbon board. It's more valuable than whatever, right? Because you're seeing it on all the jerseys all the time. Um, I think that you're going to see most schools will take that leap. Now, these things take some time to sell. I think it's an important thing to note is like, I use this example a lot of like, if you're Marshall, right? Let's use Marshall as an example, right? Like Gatorade is probably not going to come in and sponsor your jersey, right? Like for a big brand like that, that doesn't really make as much sense for them. On the flip side of that, like is your small, mom and pop, car dealership probably can't afford to spend what they're going to need to spend in order to afford that asset. So it creates this funnel of if your giant brands and your small brands aren't going to be the ones to pay for this probably, who's kind of left? Who's in that sort of next bucket? And you're seeing a lot of regional companies. The Marshall health system here was one that came up. Wisconsin's done a deal with UW Health. Regional companies. South Carolina has a deal with a sort of local or around the Carolinas construction company. You're going to see more regional deals, I think, like that. And we've seen that even in the NBA and other leagues too. Like that, the number that I always hear is that most of these jersey patch deals on the professional side are within about 200 miles of the market that they're serving, and so I think you're going to see more of that, and that's how that continues to evolve. But I think pretty much every school in America is vetting this right now, though it takes, it can take 12, 18 months to sell that asset. So because this has just been allowed, and because some schools have done more legwork on it than others, like that's why you're seeing it come in waves. But I do think I would expect that there's going to be some more.
Yeah, it's here. Ben Portnoy from the Sports Business Journal joining us here on Big 12 today. Ben, awesome stuff, man. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Thank you guys so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Ben Portnoy, college sports reporter for SBJ here on Big 12 Today on Big 12 Radio. Coming up next, what Manny Navarro from The Athletic learned after studying over 3,000 FBS transfers in the college football transfer portal. He's Ari, I'm James. This is Big 12 Radio, powered by Modelo.